Brandon Sanderson's new book released, The Soul of Flight. Despite what other people say about the ending of this book, I actually really enjoyed this book. One of the reasons that I like this book so much is because of the science behind it. I'm not going to go into any spoilers for this video, so if you have not read it, do not worry. Everything that I talk about is talked about within the first chapter and on the back of the book. I want to talk about the physics behind one of the ships that we see in this book. Don't worry if you haven't read this book, I am only going to go into minor details about a subplot within the book, and everything that I talk about will be mentioned within the first chapter or so of the book itself. One of the biggest things that we learn pretty early on in this book is the people of invention. They call themselves the Dartermen, but they're known throughout the wider Cosmere as the Guild. Now, what's interesting about these people is that they are the followers of invention. So naturally, they have this drive to learn and grow and invent new things. Because of the drive that is given to them by invention, they've kind of pushed themselves to progress further and further in technology until they're this super advanced race of people. Eventually, they become so advanced that they decide that they're going to trap their god. And so they create the Vessel of Invention. I think the name, the Vessel of Invention, is a really funny name for their ship, because the vessel is the term for someone that becomes the god, and their ship is actually housing their god. I think it's a really funny idea. The Vessel of Invention is this giant planet-sized ship. Brandon says that he got this idea from a Dyson sphere created in science fiction. If you haven't heard of a Dyson sphere, that's okay. It's not really a real thing right now. It's kind of this theoretical mega structure that a super advanced civilization builds around their sun. And the concept of it is that it's built around the sun so they can get the max amount of power out of their sun as possible. It's kind of seen as the threshold that brings your civilization into that class 5 cosmic civilization. And so the Vessel of Invention kind of plays off of that. Instead of making a Dyson sphere around their sun, they make it around their god. They employ a specific type of metal. We're not really told what this metal is, but it's alluded to be kind of a god metal. I kind of think that it's something like what Odium's metal is, where it draws investiture in. So they have a sphere around their god, and it's not really explained how they did this. But invention is in the center, and they've got this sphere around it. And the metal is around that sphere, and it's constantly drawing investiture directly from the shard into their ship. That's what powers their ship, allowing them for space travel. It doesn't really talk about what they use for propulsion, but I'm assuming that it's some sort of conversion from investiture into energy. Brandon has said, just like we have the states of matter here, where matter can be turned into energy and energy back into matter, investiture kind of follows that same thing. Investiture can become matter, and it can also become energy. The guilds use this almost infinite investiture to travel around the Cosmere. It's never really explained why, but they don't really go into the same quote-unquote neighborhood as places like Scadrial or Roshar. They kind of keep into their local neighborhood. And in this neighborhood are the shards of Whimsy, Virtuosity, Valor, and Mercy. So it's interesting that we get to kind of hear these names that we haven't really heard a whole lot up until this point in the Cosmere. One of my biggest questions when reading about this giant planet-sized spacecraft is, what is the direction of gravity? There's this meme in the Star Wars fandom of the Death Star where it shows different ways that the gravity can be on the Death Star, whether that gravity is in towards the center or down in a straight line down. I thought of that meme a lot in this book, kind of thinking, how does the gravity work on the ship? I think I've come to an answer. We know that investiture acts a whole lot like matter. In fact, it's probably just another form of matter, kind of like matter becomes energy, energy back into matter. So the more investiture that you have in a singular place, the more mass or gravity it's going to have. Think of when Wax tried to push on a metal mine that was full. He couldn't really push it really well, but once it was emptied, he could push it lots easier, because the more investiture that was inside of that metal mine, the more inertia it had and the harder it was to push. So this giant Dyson sphere-esque planet ship has an entire shard in the center of it. So I think the answer to this is that gravity goes towards the center. So instead of having layers of the ship up and down, you're going to have them kind of in a shell like onions. And in order to get from one level to another, you have to take a lift between these two shells. Which means they probably have a differential in gravity between each of the layers. Meaning the closer they got to the singularity, where invention is actually housed within the sphere, the greater the gravity that they would feel, and as they got further and further away, the less gravity that they would feel until it eventually petered off into nothingness. There's never any gravity manipulation that is ever talked about in this book, so I don't think it's actually happening. So I think that they have to rely on the mass of invention in the center of their sphere to actually have gravity on their ship. That's it for today's video. If you enjoyed my breakdown of the Dyson sphere in Soul of the Flight, or if you disagree with me on how this sphere actually works, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts.